Which comes from an Old Testament favorite. And I know you know this story, Samuel and Eli, but let's hear it this morning and go into his word with open hearts and open ears. 1 Samuel, 3rd chapter, beginning with the 2nd verse. The Lord calls Samuel. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was laying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark was. And then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" And Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went back and he lay down. Again the Lord called Samuel. "Samuel!" Samuel got up again and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel a 3rd time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down. And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood there, calling as he had the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision. But Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." And Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it that he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. And then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." God's word for God's people. Thanks be to God. Well, this is a very classic story about a classic human condition. People have a tendency to listen to what they want to listen to. I know all the wives and husbands are going, okay? But people listen to what they want to hear. Calling him. And it wasn't until the 4th time that, if you will, the light came on for Eli, where Eli realized that who was calling God, who was calling Samuel, was God. So he tells Samuel to respond by saying, "Speak, your servant is listening." Samuel didn't at first know that it was God's voice. He didn't know that God was fixing to give him some instructions, marching orders, if you will, on how he wanted him to serve. The question for us today, regardless of whether you see yourself like that young boy Samuel, who didn't yet know the voice of the Lord, or do you identify more with Eli? Maybe your eyes have begun to grow dim. Maybe your eyes are not as sharp as they once were. But the call here involved Eli and Samuel. God speaks, but do we listen? God speaks on what he wants us to do in our lives, but we have to come to an understanding that we're hearing the voice of God. So that leads us to a second concept, that we need to work on our priorities, because there will be times when listening to God is inconvenient. Listen again to verses 8 and 9. The Lord called Samuel a 3rd time, And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down. And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. If you're like me, there are two things that are the big rules in my house. Don't mess with me when I finally get to sit down and try to eat my supper. I need 3 minutes so I can eat, okay? Don't mess with my food. And the second thing is, don't mess with me when I'm trying to sleep. I'm only asking for 8 hours. That's 1/3 of the day. I want to sleep. I've about got the kids trained, but those doggone dogs, there's no hope for them understanding that when the master is this way, you don't put your cold nose on her. Only when the master is this way, okay? So those dogs have to learn that there's no messing with the master when she's sleeping, okay? But there's hope for them. I can only imagine poor old Eli. Can you imagine this kid that you've taken into the temple to raise? This kid that's been with you for years. Keeps on coming in there, and waking you up. And you don't know why, and he doesn't know why. He just keeps coming. I bet he was pretty frustrated. And I'll bet that even like our gospel lesson that Annette read to us, that I bet Nathaniel was probably getting him a little snooze under that fig tree when Jesus called him too. So maybe that's something that's a theme for us. God speaks to us sometimes when we slow down enough, and that may be in our sleep. Tomorrow we commemorate the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King and his ministry above us. And we can look at a story from his life to remind us about trying to keep God as a priority in our lives. The story is about January 1956. It was right before the Montgomery bus boycott. Dr. King was asleep, and he got interrupted. It was a phone call, and it was very threatening, and it upset him a lot. So he went down to the kitchen to try to calm down, and he decided he needed to have this opportunity during his upset time to go to God with this problem because he didn't know what to do. He was very tired, and he didn't know what to do. So he spoke to God, and the records say that he experienced a divine voice. And it said that he could hear in that voice a reassurance in that inner voice, saying to him, "Stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth. God will be at your side forever." And he said his fears and uncertainties ceased because God spoke to him and gave him an inner calm. God provided him the interior resources that he needed for him to do the work to which he was called. He needed to speak to God first, though, and let God know that he was listening. God speaks, and we respond by serving. Because the first priority of a disciple is to listen to God's voice, to listen before we act. We need to keep that priority ever before us. You know, the old saying, haste makes waste. It's so true. I live by it, I think. But in this idea of prayer before service doesn't mean that we're allowed to sit in the pew of passivity. It means we must still listen and be ready to do what God calls us to do, to act when he says go. Samuel listened, and it was revealed to him that it was time to do something. He opened his ear to God, and he received what his duty was to serve God. And what he was called to do was not easy, because Samuel was called to take and serve in a time that was full of turmoil. A war was pending. There was all kind of change going on. Samuel couldn't even lay down very long because verse 3, 5, 6, and 9 reminds us that he kept popping up, that he had to get up and act on what God was giving him, that he had to get up from his comfortable situation, which was lying down and relaxing, and respond to this God who was calling him to serve. And lastly, in order for us to hear what God is calling to us, we have to take and tell God we're listening. almost being permission giving. All right, God, this is your time. Speak. Your servant is listening. It's great advice. It's great advice for all of us to consider. But I think it's rather odd that this advice came from Eli. Eli had not really listened to God for a long, long time. Eli had not really heard about God's will in his life because he had made a mess of things. Eli wasn't even able to take and share an understanding of God's call with his own sons. Eli had struggled with these boys, had we read further in this chapter. He'd struggled with these sons that served as priests, with making a complete mess. But you know what? God doesn't give up on us. God was going to use Eli, even though his sight was dim, even though his own efforts to make godly men out of his sons had come to no avail, even though Eli was weary of years and years of trying. God still had a plan for him, and how Eli was to help be part of the plan for Samuel coming into being. But Eli had to be close enough to hear God's word himself. So if you're going to hear God, you've got to give God permission to speak to your heart. And that's not always easy, considering our hearts try to trick us. Our hearts try to give us a different story altogether. But if we make a decision to listen to God, it can change our lives. There's a story about a man named Roy. And he grew up in a family that had this really rigid understanding of what God's word was. It wasn't a book to inspire and guide and help us through our hard times. To this family, it was a book of rules. Everything was black and white. The shalls and the shall nots. Black and white. These things you can do, and these things you may never do. A rule book. So this man, Roy, grew up in a family that just was all about the rules. And by the time he got old enough to go out on his own, he not only left home, but he left the church. He'd had enough of those bizarre rules of what he could do and couldn't do. And so he spent his life as a mean, ornery, cantankerous man, not wanting a thing to do with church, not caring a thing about God's children, about God's people. He didn't try to even pretend at being nice. He was just a world-class grump. And as he got older, as it happens with many of us, he became more introspective. He started thinking about the deeper things in life. He slowed down enough when he got about 60 to start thinking about God. And somehow it brought him back into the church. This church he'd walked away from. This church full of this rigid rules. And he walked back into church. And he'd come late, so he didn't have to talk to anybody. And he'd slide in and grab that back pew. And right before the benediction, he'd slide out. Well, the people tried to witness to him. The people tried to relate to him. But Roy would have no part of it. He wasn't interested in those hypocrites. But he kept coming. And he kept coming. And years went by. And the people couldn't understand why Roy would come late and leave early. Finally, it dawned on Roy that he did